À présent, on reste dans l'air. Vous le savez, l'homme n'est pas fait pour respirer dans l'eau.
Hello, everybody.
À présent, on reste
It's a
dans
pleasure
l'air.
for us to share this online session with you today. As you can see, we are four people for us to discuss with you, with the idea to answer your questions during this session. And I introduce you three people that you already know if you follow the forum. Let's start with Xiang and Estelle and also Elise. We have been starting for 1 month answering your question in the forum, and that's the objective of this session. Please don't hesitate to ask a question, to write your questions in the YouTube session, and we will see it and answering them as soon as we have seen it. So, but just before answering your first questions, just a few information for you. First, you have to know that you are 4,000 people following this MOOC, 2,000 in English and 2,000 in French, and that's a success, and we are grateful for that. And I would say that probably 20-25% of this figure are people who are actively participate in the videos, the forum, and answering the evaluations. So thank you for that. So you had a lot of homeworks to do these last 2 weeks, and maybe we would first start, before answering questions, in giving some comments about those homeworks. Which one to start? Maybe about hyper and hypoventilation. Would you say that there were many comments about a particular points about this homework?
Yeah, a lot of people commented about the hypo and hyperventilation, whether it was possible or not. Mm-hmm. And also, some people were saying that when they do sports, they call that hyperventilation because they breathe more rapidly, which is not exactly the same thing. So there was a bit of confusion about that.
Yes, exactly. It's very important. When you play sport, you are just doing something physiological, and you just ventilate more because you have to, because you make exercise, but you do not hyperventilate. Hyperventilate or hypoventilating is not a normal thing. You can hyperventilate if you start breathing rapidly. It's possible to do that, but just for a few minutes maximum. After that, you have to calm down and to restore a normal respiration. And that's the same for hypoventilation. That's impossible to do that. Of course, you can stay without any respiration during 1 or 2 minutes. That's possible, but you cannot do it longer. This hypo or hyperventilate are not normal things, and that's the opposite of ventilating more when you are playing sport. There was a homework about colors, skin colors, especially in African black people, and there were many good answers in the forum about about that, and you were focusing on the importance of looking at the mucosae instead of the skin, because the mucosae are thinner than the skin, and that's the right way to appreciate a very pale color or a bluish color in black people. Even it remains very, very difficult, in fact, especially for the bluish color. Even in white people, it's difficult to see because it's a late sign of a very difficult and very serious disease. And even in a white person, it's difficult to see.
There was also the homework about PaO2.
Yes. Just before you ask your question, I would like to remind you, now this session is for you. Just don't hesitate to post a question while we are still answering other questions in the format. If you have new questions, it's very important to write them now so that we can answer you right away.
So there was 2 calculations, the P big AO2 and the P little AO2. Some people use the answer of the P big AO2 in the other calculation. They replaced it with the 105. And also, I think that was pretty clear, but the real P little AO2 needs to be measured and not calculated.
Exactly, that's the main point. We are speaking about oxygen pressure in blood, which can only be measured if we want to have the right measurement. And this homework is not really possible. It's a homework about appreciation, estimation of a value which has to be measured. And therefore, there can be differences in the answers. And I would say this MOOC is considered as difficult with all the things that you have to remind and retain. And therefore, it might be difficult to use the right formula, but at the end, your answer were quite good. And that's true. That's an easy formula to appreciate your oxygen in the blood would be 105 minus the H divided by 2. And this figure of 105 should not be changed with another value. That's right, you were right. And if you keep in mind this easy formula, that's a very, very good point. Yes, Estelle?
We also have some questions about anatomical dead space and dysfunction. And it's important to realize that anatomical dead space has a role of conduction of the air through the airways to the alveoli, and is not included in exchange of O2.
You are right, and I have nothing else to add to what you have just said, Estelle, and that's a very, very important point. The respiratory ways, just for conducting, like highways, to conduct the air, and the other ways to have the exchanges between oxygen and CO2. That's important to make the difference, certainly.
Professor, many people have comments about anemia and cyanosis and how to actually see them in people. Could you explain us more about anemia and cyanosis and their differences?
Yes, that's important. about the colors, just to retain that anemia is the situation where your transport of oxygen by the hemoglobin is less good because of a shortage in hemoglobin. And the color will be white. And cyanosis is a situation where your level of hemoglobin is normal, but each molecule of hemoglobin transports less oxygen than it's possible to do. And the changes of the hemoglobin configuration has an impact on the color of the blood and this hemoglobin, which becomes bluish instead of a normal color of the blood, which is more red. Do I understand? Do I answer these questions, or do you think that there might have been additional questions about this point? Okay, okay. At this time, is there
No new questions.
no? And can we say how many people are? You have to know that there are only 6 people following now this session. I'm just asking to those 6 people, they are not patient, that you can ask your questions if you want, and it would be for us a pleasure to see your questions and answering them. Otherwise, we know that most of you will follow this session afterwards, and will have the opportunity to hear our answers to your previous homeworks. Do you think there will be additional questions for the moment? While you are just having a look, I'm just telling what will happen from the coming in the next weeks of this MOOC. And I have to inform you that for the moment it was the most difficult part of this MOOC because of the theory about oxygen and CO2, which was quite difficult for everybody, and that's normal. And we will start from next week with more everyday life situation of respiration, like altitude, sport, or respiration when you smoke cigarettes or with pollutants and so on. And the week after will be dedicated to diseases like asthma, bronchitis, emphysema, and so on. And the last week will be new videos on particular situations like diving or pollutants. Again, another session on pollutants. So you can a little bit see that the more you will go on in this MOOC, the more you will see situations which are closer to your everyday life. What do you think? Is there any additional questions?
There is a new question here, so I'm just going to read the question. The text note states, CO2 is produced by every cell in our organism, then transported in our veins to our lungs. The production of CO2 is approximately 200 milliliters per minute, but you remember you consume about 250 milliliters of O2 per minute. So in a resting condition, the ratio between your CO2 production and your O2 consumption is 200 over 250, and that makes 0.8. This is your famous respiratory quotient. You produce a bit less CO2 than you consume O2. Each O2 has 2 O atoms. Each CO2 has 2 O atoms. How is this 50 milliliters per minute extra O2 consumed without producing CO2 in our body? Where does the 50 milliliters per minute extra O2 go?
I understand the question. 50 milliliters between the 200 and the 250 would have to be somewhere.
Yeah, why doesn't it become O2, CO2?
Yes, because that's a molecular question which overcomes what I teach about. That's about Atoma, that there is no one-to-one ratio between oxygen and CO2. When you are on the cellular place and you have there mitochondria, which are the small particles inside the cell to use oxygen and produce CO2, it is not about the molecular point of view a one-to-one. This is not so simple to think that there should be 50 milliliters somewhere. No, the oxygen is change in producing energy for the cell and CO2. This about the molecular point of view, this oxygen with some enzymes becomes CO2 and energy. And it's not one oxygen which becomes just one CO2. It's a little bit more complicated. But for the last message, which is very important, overall, you produce a little bit less CO2 than you consume oxygen. That's the main message.
There is a question about CO2. Some people do freediving or apnea as sport. What happens with CO2 pressure when CO2 is not released from the lungs? So I guess that goes to hypercapnia.
Yes, yes, that's an important question, which will be more debated when you will have the video on respiration during apnea, during diving. And but just to answer this question, if you stop breathing while diving or just deciding to stay in apnea, of course, after 1 minute, I would say, your level of CO2 will increase in your blood, and if it's now 40 millimeter mercury in your blood, it will become 50 instead of 40, which can be called hypercapnia or hypoventilation. It might answer this definition, but it can just last 1 minute, maximum 2 or 3 minutes. And after that, your body will demand that you start breathing again so that your CO2 will decrease and restore a normal value of 40 milliliters mercury. Do you see? Last question, and I ask the question to the audience who are following us for the moment. That's our last call for question if you want.
You guys can post your questions either under the YouTube video or on the platform. So whenever you have a question, go ahead.
Otherwise, you have to know that the forum, discussion forum, will go on during the next weeks with the same person to answer your questions. Thus, you will certainly still have the possibility to ask your question later if you want. If there is no question, Elise is still, yes?
Yes. About apnea, some people use hyperventilation before doing an apnea. What are the mechanisms of that?
Very interesting question again. The idea is the following. If you make hyperventilation before diving, before apnea, you will have a lower level of CO2 in your blood, and also a lower level of CO2 in your alveoli, which means that you have more place for oxygen, which means that you start your diving and your apnea with better values for oxygen than if you don't do that. And of course, it will allow you to have a longer period of apnea, because when you start your apnea, your oxygen will goes down slowly, and your CO2 will increase slowly. But you start with better values, higher oxygen, lower CO2. This decrease of oxygen will last longer, and your increase in CO2 will also last longer. But the danger of performing a hyperventilation before starting apnea, okay, you can have a longer apnea, but the risk is to overcome a point where the oxygen will become too low, and then there is a risk of syncope, of hypoxia, not enough oxygen in your body. And that might be the danger, but I would say the importance to be careful when you hyperventilate before doing an apnea.
I can read that you fell in syncope before have the reflex of breathe, and
that's the real danger of people making apnea and diving too long, and where they forget or they psychologically demand to overcome a normal stop moment where you have to stop, and they don't want to stop, and they go on, and they make suddenly a syncope, which is a classical danger of making this kind of exercise. Of course, it remains rare, but it exists, certainly. Last question?
As stated in the very first video of this MOOC, it's about nitrogen. Nitrogen was there at the beginning of the Earth, and even now. Now when we measure it, we know that its composition in the air is actually 78%, so it's pretty much. What does it do? Does it have any interaction in the body?
You ask a good question about nitrogen, and that's true that we are so busy in speaking about oxygen and CO2 in this MOOC that we don't focus on nitrogen, which is the most important gas in our environment, 78, 79%. And this oxygen diffuses inside all our body spaces until all our cells. But there is no active exchange between the nitrogen outside and the nitrogens inside our cells, which means that there is a good balance between the nitrogen pressures outside our body and inside. And nitrogen goes on and goes out normally in all our organism without any exchange. And that's the main difference between nitrogen and oxygen and CO2, of course. And that's the reason why nitrogen is so important in quantity, but without a direct effect on our respiration. And nitrogen was also the most important gas at the beginning of the Earth. There was CO2, there was a water vapor, and there was, of course, nitrogen, certainly. If there is no new question in the forum, I advise to finish now this session. And again, I would like to thank all of you who are following this MOOC since now 1 month, since the month February, to thank you about your enthusiasm and collaboration. And we hope that you find good answers to your question. Thanks to our team. Thank you, Elise, Estelle, and Xiang for your work. And you will hear of us from next week about the new sessions and new lessons. Goodbye.